I need you to think about something before I tell you this story. Think about every long drive you've ever taken alone at night. The highway ahead of you reduced to 2 cones of headlight cutting through darkness. The radio fading in and out. The mile markers ticking past. The particular loneliness of being the only vehicle on a road that stretches to the horizon in both directions. And at some point during that drive, you got tired. Your eyes started to feel heavy. Your reaction time slowed. The painted center line started doing that hypnotic thing where it pulls your focus until you catch yourself and correct. And you made a decision. I need to pull over. It is the responsible decision. The safe decision. The decision that driving instructors and highway patrol officers and every road safety campaign ever produced tells you to make. Pull over. Rest. Continue when you're alert. Eddie Garza made that decision on the night of March 9, 2020. He was a 47-year-old commercial truck driver out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. 17 years behind the wheel. Over 2 million miles logged without a single serious incident. A professional. A man who knew the highways of the upper Midwest the way a sailor knows open water, every current, every hazard, every place where the conditions could turn on you without warning. He was running a solo overnight freight haul from Milwaukee to Duluth, Minnesota, a route he had driven more than 40 times. U.S. Highway 51 north through Wisconsin, connecting to US 2 at Hurley, then west into Minnesota. At approximately 11:47 p.m., somewhere between Merrill and Tomahawk in Lincoln County, Wisconsin, a section of US 51 that cuts through some of the densest and most remote forest in the Wisconsin Northwoods, Eddie Garza felt his eyes getting heavy. And he made the responsible decision. He pulled his Kenworth T680 onto a wide gravel shoulder, cut the engine, set the air brakes, climbed into the sleeper berth, set his phone alarm for 90 minutes. He closed his eyes at 11:52 p.m. At 12:34 a.m., 42 minutes later, something woke him up. Not his alarm. Something outside the truck. What happened over the next 4 hours and 11 minutes on that gravel shoulder of U.S. Highway 51 in Lincoln County, Wisconsin, is what Eddie Garza spent the following 3 years trying to find the right person to tell. I am that person. My name is not important. What's important is that I found Eddie Garza through a network of researchers and investigators who collect accounts from commercial truck drivers, a community that spends more time alone on remote American highways at night than almost any other profession, and which has, accordingly, accumulated a body of encounter testimony that the mainstream world knows almost nothing about. Eddie told me his story over 2 separate conversations. 6 hours of recorded testimony. A man who chose his words with the careful precision of someone who has told this story in his head thousands of times and knows exactly which details matter and which ones people will fixate on for the wrong reasons. This is his story, exactly as he told it to me. And when it's over, I promise you, you will never again think of a dark highway rest stop the same way. 17 years, 2 million miles, one night. Before I put you in that sleeper berth with Eddie Garza at 12:34 a.m. on March 9, 2020, I want you to understand who Eddie Garza was before that night. Because the credibility of what he experienced depends entirely on understanding the kind of man he was. And the kind of man he was before March 9, 2020, was not someone who scared easily. Was not someone given to imagination or exaggeration or the particular kind of loneliness-fueled perception distortion that long-haul driving can produce in less experienced drivers. Eddie grew up in Racine, Wisconsin. Second-generation Mexican-American, the son of a machinist and a school cafeteria worker. He started driving commercially at 29 after a decade working construction. He told me he switched because construction in Wisconsin is a 6-month-a-year industry, and he had 2 kids and a mortgage, and needed year-round income. He took to trucking immediately and completely. There was something about the long-haul life that suited his particular temperament, the self-sufficiency of it, the problem-solving. The physical and mental discipline of managing a 40-ton vehicle through every weather condition the upper Midwest could produce. He described himself to me as a man who was most comfortable when he was the only person responsible for the outcome of a situation. 17 years of overnight freight. Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, Iowa. The full geography of the upper Midwest at 3 a.m. He had driven through blizzards that reduced visibility to zero. He had navigated black ice on mountain grades. He had dealt with tire blowouts at highway speed, mechanical failures in remote locations, wildlife strikes, and every other hazard the road could produce. He had never been frightened by the dark. His wife Maria, they had been married 23 years, told me when I spoke with her separately that in 17 years of overnight hauling, Eddie had never once called her from the road because he was scared. Stressed, yes. Tired, yes. Frustrated, yes. Never scared. After March 9, 2020, that changed. He called me at 4:47 in the morning, Maria told me. He never called me from the road that early. I knew before I picked up that something was wrong. His voice. I'd been with that man for 23 years. I know every version of his voice. The voice on that call was a version I had never heard before. She paused. He didn't tell me what happened. Not on that call. He just said he was okay, he was back on the road, he'd be home in 2 days. And then he said, and this is the part I've thought about every day since, he said, Maria, I need you to know that I love you and the kids. I need to say that right now. She looked at me steadily. Men who say that at 4:47 in the morning after a night haul have seen something that made them need to confirm that the people they love are still real. That's what that call was. He needed to hear my voice to confirm that normal things still existed. US 51 North, the road that doesn't forgive stops. US Highway 51 through Lincoln County, Wisconsin, is not a road that gets discussed in travel writing or tourism content. It is a working road. A freight road. A road that connects the industrial south of Wisconsin to the timber and mining communities of the north. Running through 200 miles of progressively thickening forest as it moves toward the Minnesota border. The section between Merrill and Tomahawk, approximately 18 miles, is where the forest gets serious. The Northwoods close in on both sides of the highway with a density and darkness that even experienced Wisconsin drivers find oppressive at night. No towns of any significance. No truck stops. No rest areas with facilities. Just the highway and the trees and the occasional logging road turnoff that disappears into the darkness between the pines. The gravel shoulder where Eddie pulled over was at a point where the highway curves slightly east before straightening back north. A section of road that experienced northbound drivers know has a tendency to collect drowsy truckers because the curve is gentle enough to feel like a straight if your attention lapses. There is no official rest area. No designation of any kind. Just a wide spot in the gravel where the shoulder broadens enough to accommodate a commercial vehicle safely. Eddie had pulled over at this exact spot twice before in 17 years. He knew it was there. He had filed it in the mental catalog of safe stops that long-haul drivers compile over years of running the same routes. What he did not know, what no one had told him, because no one in a position to tell him had reason to believe it was relevant information, was what the forest on the east side of that highway contained. I researched the specific geography after my conversations with Eddie. The forest on the east side of US 51 at that location is part of a large contiguous block of Wisconsin Northwoods timber, pine, spruce, birch, and hardwood, that extends eastward for approximately 22 miles before hitting the first significant road. No hiking trails in that immediate section. No hunting access roads within 3 miles north or south of Eddie's stopping point. No documented human activity in the immediate forest. What I found in the Lincoln County historical records and in the files of a Wisconsin DNR wildlife biologist I contacted, a woman named Dr. Patricia Reeves, who had spent 12 years studying large predator behavior in the Wisconsin Northwoods, was a pattern of reports from that specific corridor of US 51 that nobody had ever connected into a coherent picture. 14 separate incident reports filed with the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department between 2004 and 2020. All of them from drivers, truckers, late-night commuters, one highway patrol officer, describing encounters with a large upright figure on or near the highway shoulder in that 18-mile corridor. 14 reports. 16 years. Never connected. Never investigated collectively. The Highway Patrol Officer's report, filed in 2011, was the most detailed. I obtained it through a public records request. The officer, a 9-year veteran of the Wisconsin State Patrol named Marcus Webb, not the same Marcus Webb from our Michigan story. A different man, had been running northbound on US 51 at approximately 2:15 a.m. when his dashcam captured something crossing the highway ahead of him. Upright. Crossing from the west tree line to the east tree line in 4 strides. At a speed his incident report calculated, based on dashcam timestamp and lane width, at approximately 28 miles per hour. 28 miles per hour. Bipedal. 4 strides across a 4-lane highway. The patrol officer pulled over. Activated his emergency lights. Got out of his cruiser. He found footprints in the soft gravel of the eastbound shoulder. Bipedal. Enormous. He measured them with his duty equipment. His report noted the prints measured 16 inches in length. He got back in his cruiser and drove north without logging a stop. He filed the report the following morning and, according to Dr. Reeves, who had obtained a copy through her own research, received a phone call from his supervisor that afternoon. She did not know what was said in that call. She knew the report was filed and then effectively buried, not deleted, not destroyed, just filed in a category that ensured it would never be cross-referenced with anything else. This was the highway Eddie Garza pulled onto the gravel shoulder of at 11:52 p.m. on March 9, 2020. What woke him up? Eddie described the moment of waking to me twice, once in our first conversation and once in our second, 3 weeks later. Both descriptions were identical in every detail. The consistency of a man who has replayed this moment so many times that it has worn a permanent groove. He was in the sleeper berth, lying on his back. Fully asleep, not the light dozing of a man who can't quite let go of alertness, but genuinely, deeply asleep the way a physically exhausted professional goes under when horizontal. Something woke him at 12:34 a.m. Not a sound. Not initially. The sensation first. He described it as a pressure change. The specific way the air inside a vehicle cabin changes when something with significant mass comes close to the exterior, the slight compression of the air column. The almost imperceptible decrease in the ambient sound from outside as a large body absorbs and blocks it. He had experienced this sensation once before in 17 years of trucking. A deer, a large buck, had walked up to his stationary truck during a rest stop in Minnesota years earlier and pressed its face against the passenger window to investigate. The air pressure change had woken him from a light doze that time too. This was the same sensation, but significantly more pronounced. Whatever was outside his truck was not a deer. He opened his eyes. Cab was dark. He kept the sleeper completely blacked out for daytime sleeping, habit. He lay still for a moment, establishing where he was, why he was stopped, what the situation was. Then he heard it. A sound against the driver's side of the truck. Not a knock. Not a scrape. Something he described, after long consideration during our conversation, as a placement. The sound of something being placed against the exterior of the truck with deliberate, controlled contact. Like a hand pressed flat against the metal of the cab door. The slight resonance of the cab wall transmitting the contact. He sat up. He moved from the sleeper to the driver's seat without turning on any interior lights, pure instinct. The instinct of someone who understands that light inside a dark vehicle illuminates the interior to anything outside while blinding the driver to everything beyond the glass. He sat in the driver's seat in darkness and looked out the windows. What he saw on the driver's side window stopped every conscious thought in his head. A face. Looking in? Not human. What was looking in at 12:34 a.m.? I want to be precise here because precision matters. Eddie Garza is not a man who uses dramatic language. He is not a storyteller by nature. He is an accountant of experience, a man who logs what happened in the same methodical way he logs his hours and his miles. When I asked him to describe what he saw at that window, he was quiet for almost 30 seconds before he spoke. Then he described it with the flat, careful delivery of a man giving a deposition. The face was at the driver's side window. His window. The window of a Kenworth T680 cab sits approximately 7 feet off the ground when the truck is on level surface. On the gravel shoulder of US 51, on ground that sloped very slightly toward the tree line, he estimated his window at 6 feet 8 inches to 7 feet off the ground. The face at that window was looking in at approximately the same level. Which means whatever it was attached to was standing with its head at 6.5 to 7 feet off the ground. Standing. Upright. The face itself. He said. It was not a human face. It was not a bare face. It was not anything I have a name for. The closest thing I can give you is a German shepherd's face, the shape of it, the muzzle, the skull structure, but scaled up to something that had no business existing. The snout was long, wide at the base, and slightly tapered. The eyes were forward-facing, like a predator, not like a prey animal. And the eyes were... He stopped. The eyes were the part that I keep coming back to. Because the eyes were looking at me the way I look at a map. Like they were reading information. Like what they saw in my face was data being processed. Not hunger. Not aggression. Something more like assessment. He looked at his hands. I've had people try to tell me it was a bear standing up against the truck. I've had people tell me it was another driver messing with me. I've had people tell me I was sleep-deprived and hallucinating. I want you to understand something. I have seen black bears in Wisconsin. I know what a black bear's face looks like from close range. What was at my window had a face with a structure no bear has. And no person has. And no thing I have ever encountered in 47 years of living in Wisconsin has. The face was at the window for approximately 8 seconds. 8 seconds during which Eddie Garza sat completely frozen in his driver's seat with no interior lights on. 16 inches of air and a pane of glass between himself and whatever was looking in at him. Then it was gone. Not suddenly. Not with a startle. It withdrew. Deliberately. The way something moves when it has finished looking and has made a decision about what it saw. Eddie sat in the dark for a long time after the face withdrew. Then he heard the footsteps. It did not leave. This is the part of Eddie's account that separates it from a simple encounter story and turns it into something that I have not been able to stop thinking about since he told it to me. The face at the window was not the end. It was the beginning. After the face withdrew from the driver's side window, Eddie heard footsteps. On gravel. Moving from the driver's side of the truck toward the rear. Heavy. Bipedal. The specific sound of something walking on loose gravel was significant weight, not the skittering of an animal but the deliberate, 2-beat compression of bipedal steps. The steps went to the rear of the truck. Stopped. Silence for approximately 2 minutes. Then footsteps again. Moving along the passenger side now. Toward the front. He tracked them by sound, the gravel transmitting the weight clearly in the still night air. The steps stopped at the passenger side front corner. Near the passenger door. Silence. Then, and Eddie's voice changed when he told me this part, dropping to something quieter and more controlled, then a sound against the passenger door. The same placement sound he'd heard against the driver's door. Something pressed flat against the metal. On the other side now. It had circled the truck and was pressing against the opposite door. I asked Eddie what he thought in that moment. He said, I thought, it's testing the doors. He paused to let that land. It went to one door. Then it went to the other. It was checking them. Like it understood what a door was. Like it understood that doors open. That's not animal behavior. That's something else. What followed was 4 hours and 11 minutes during which Eddie Garza sat in the driver's seat of his stationary Kenworth T680 on the gravel shoulder of U.S. Highway 51 in Lincoln County, Wisconsin, and did not start the engine. He did not start the engine because of a decision he made in the first 20 minutes that he described to me as the most coldly rational decision he has ever made in his life. I know what a diesel engine starting sounds like from outside a truck. It's loud. It's sudden. It produces exhaust and vibration and heat and light from the instrument panel simultaneously. I did not know what starting the engine would cause it to do. Whether it would run. Whether it would attack the truck. Whether it would. He stopped. I didn't know if the glass would hold. That's the truth of it. I'm sitting there doing the math in my head. What does that face weigh? What's behind that face in terms of mass and muscle? And I'm looking at my driver's side window and I'm doing the math on whether the glass would hold if that thing decided the glass was worth breaking. And I decided the answer was no. So I sat still. And I waited. Over those 4 hours and 11 minutes the creature, and there was no question in Eddie's mind after the first 20 minutes that it was one specific thing. Present and deliberate, and not leaving, moved around his truck in patterns that he tracked entirely by sound. It circled. Slowly. Completely. The way it had gone from driver's side to passenger side, it continued, front to passenger to rear to driver, and again, and again. It stopped at the driver's door 3 more times over the course of the night. Each time the placement sound. Each time silence after. Twice it stopped at the rear of the truck for extended periods. He could hear, faintly but distinctly, breathing during these stops. Deep. Measured. An organism with a large respiratory system, breathing without urgency. At approximately 2:15 a.m., nearly 2 hours after the initial encounter, something happened that Eddie said was the moment his self-control came closest to failing entirely. The truck moved. Not violently. Not dramatically. A subtle, slow shift in the suspension, the kind of shift that happens when significant weight is applied to the exterior of the vehicle. Not inside the cargo trailer, the vehicle's cab. Something was leaning against the cab with enough force to compress the suspension. He felt it in the seat. The weight of something enormous pressing against the outside of his truck. For 4 minutes, he timed it on his phone, the suspension remained slightly compressed. Then it released. The truck settled back to level. And the footsteps resumed. The engine and what happened after. At 4:43 a.m., 4 hours and 11 minutes after he first heard the footsteps on the gravel, Eddie made a decision. He had been watching the sky through the windshield. The specific quality of darkness was changing. Not light yet, not even close to dawn. But that almost imperceptible shift in the black that happens in the last hour before first light, when the sky at the absolute eastern horizon loses its deepest density by a fraction. He had been waiting for this. He had decided, somewhere around 2 a.m., that he was going to start the engine at the first suggestion of pre-dawn. Not because daylight guaranteed safety. He had no evidence that daylight would change anything about the situation. But because pre-dawn was the psychological moment when he felt he could act without his hands shaking badly enough to affect his ability to drive. He needed to be able to drive the moment the engine turned over. He reached for the ignition. He stopped for a moment with his hand on the key. Because in the silence of that moment, the footsteps had stopped about 20 minutes earlier, and he had not heard anything since, he became aware of something. He could not hear the creature. For the first time since 12:34 a.m., the gravel outside his truck was silent. He didn't know if it had left. He didn't know when it had left. He didn't know if the silence meant it was gone or if it meant it had moved to a position where its feet were no longer on gravel. The tree line was 40 feet from his passenger side. The tree line where the ground would be soft forest floor, silent under any weight. He turned the key. The Kenworth's engine turned over with the particular diesel roar that anyone who has spent time around commercial trucks knows, a sound that is loud and sudden and fills the environment completely. The instant the engine started, Eddie had his hand on the gear's shift. He told me, "I gave it 4 seconds to warm enough to move. 4 seconds. The longest 4 seconds of my life. And then I was in gear and I was on the highway and I had my foot on the accelerator, and I did not look in my mirrors." He drove north without stopping for 67 miles. To the first truck stop with lights and other vehicles and human presence, where he pulled in and sat in the parking lot with the engine running for 40 minutes before he could make himself get out to use the restroom. He called Maria at 4:47 a.m. When he finally got out of the truck at that lit truck stop in Mercer, Wisconsin, he did something, and he told me this with obvious discomfort, as if it was an admission of something he still hadn't fully processed. He walked around his truck, looking at the exterior. On the driver's side door, at approximately 7 feet off the ground, consistent with the height of the face at the window, there was a smear on the metal surface. A contact mark. The kind of mark left by a surface pressed against painted metal. Slightly moist, slightly warm to the touch even in the cold pre-dawn air. He photographed it on his phone. On the passenger side door, at the same height, the same mark. Same quality. Same moisture. On the rear corner of the cab, where the creature had stopped and leaned against the truck, a larger impression. The paint slightly compressed in a shape that was roughly consistent with the upper arm and shoulder of something very large pressing against it. He photographed everything. He still has those photographs. What was already known about that road? I spent 3 weeks after my conversations with Eddie researching the specific corridor of U.S. Highway 51 between Merrill and Tomahawk in Lincoln County, Wisconsin. What I found confirmed what Eddie had experienced in a way that no reasonable person could dismiss as coincidence. The 14 Sheriff's Department incident reports I mentioned earlier, I obtained all of them through public records requests filed with Lincoln County and the Wisconsin State Patrol. Reading them sequentially, chronologically, was one of the more disturbing research experiences of my career. Because the pattern was undeniable. Every report described encounters within the same approximately 6-mile section of the highway. Every report described something large and bipedal. Every report came from drivers, people moving through the corridor, not residents, not repeat visitors. People who had no reason to have heard previous reports, and no community of shared experience to draw from. And yet the descriptions matched. Height, consistently reported between 7 and 8 feet. Bipedal gait. Dark coloration. Forward-facing eyes with significant eye shine in headlights. The specific way it moved, described variously as purposeful, deliberate, unhurried by witnesses who had never spoken to each other. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the Wisconsin DNR wildlife biologist, agreed to speak with me on condition that I not identify her by her full name or specific research affiliation in this documentary. She had spent 12 years studying large predator ecology in the Wisconsin Northwoods. She had seen Eddie's encounter. I sent her a summary, and had compared it with 3 other accounts in her personal research files from the same corridor. She told me, "I am a scientist. My professional framework is built on documented, peer-reviewed evidence. I cannot tell you officially that what these people encountered is a real biological organism that exists outside current taxonomy. What I can tell you is that the behavioral consistency across these accounts is not consistent with known misidentification. A bear does not press its face against a truck window at 7 feet of height. A bear does not systematically test both doors of a vehicle. A bear does not compress the suspension of a Kenworth cab by leaning against it. Bears do not do these things because bears do not conceptualize doors or vehicles in these terms. Whatever these people saw, it conceptualized those things." She was quiet for a moment. "That's the part that keeps me up at night. Not the size. Not the physical description. The behavior. The behavior of something that understands human objects and human spaces in a way that implies a level of cognitive engagement with the human world that we have no framework to account for. The Highway Patrol officer's dashcam footage, the 2011 recording of something crossing the highway at 28 miles per hour in 4 strides, I attempted to obtain through my public records request. I was told the dashcam recording from that incident was not available. Not deleted. Not destroyed. Not available. I asked for clarification on the distinction. I did not receive a response. 2 million miles in one night, that changed everything. I spoke with Eddie Garza for the last time 6 weeks ago. He is still driving. Still running overnight freight in the upper Midwest. Still logging the miles with the same professional discipline he brought to 17 years before March 9, 2020. But things are different. He no longer pulls over on U.S. Highway 51 between Merrill and Tomahawk. He plans his rest stops around that corridor with the specificity of a man who has learned exactly where a hazard exists and builds his route to account for it. He told the story to 3 other drivers in the 2 years after March 2020, men he trusted, men with long experience on the same routes. 2 of them, independently, told him they had heard things about that section of 51. Not encounters of their own, just the accumulated informal knowledge of the trucking community, passed at truck stops and way stations and over CB channels. That stretch of road had a reputation among certain long-haul drivers. Nothing specific. Nothing documented. Just a general consensus, passed quietly and without elaboration, that the Merrill to Tomahawk corridor of US 51 was a section of highway you did not stop on after dark. Eddie had never heard it before March 2020 because in 17 years he had never needed to stop there. He had always had enough fuel and enough hours to push through without stopping. The one time he stopped, the responsible decision, the safe decision, the decision every driving instructor would commend, the one time he pulled onto that gravel shoulder. He spent 4 hours and 11 minutes in the dark learning why experienced drivers kept moving. He told me something in our final conversation that I have thought about constantly since. He said, "You know what I think about most? Not the face at the window. Not the sound of it walking on the gravel. Not even the truck moving when it leaned on it. You know what I think about most?" I asked him what. "I think about the fact that it walked around my truck for 4 hours and 11 minutes and then it left. It chose to leave. Whatever was going through its head during those 4 hours, whatever assessment it was making, whatever decision process was happening, at the end of it, it chose to walk back into those trees. And I've thought about what the other choice would have looked like. A Kenworth T680 weighs about 35,000 pounds empty. And I sat in that truck doing the math on whether that glass would hold. That's how scared I was. 35,000 pounds of truck, and I was sitting there calculating whether the glass would hold. He looked at his hands. It left because it wanted to leave. That's the only explanation. It was there for 4 hours. If it wanted to get into that truck, it would have gotten into that truck. It left because whatever it needed to know about me, it found out. And then it went back into those trees. And I drove north. And that's the whole story." He was quiet for a moment. "Except it's not the whole story. Because I still drive that highway. And every single time I go through that corridor, every single time, in daylight or dark, winter or summer, I look at the tree line on the east side of the road. And sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes, I see something move between the trees. Just a suggestion of movement. Just a mass shifting in the darkness between the pines." He looked up at me. "And every time I see it, I keep driving. Because that's the lesson. That's the only lesson that corridor has to teach, and it taught it to me the hard way. You keep driving. You do not stop. You keep driving. U.S. Highway 51 between Merrill and Tomahawk. Lincoln County, Wisconsin. It looks like every other section of northbound highway in the Wisconsin Northwoods. 2 lanes in each direction. Pine trees on both sides. Mile markers ticking past in the headlights. A road you've probably driven without a second thought if you've ever made the run from central Wisconsin to the Upper Peninsula or into Minnesota. Tonight, someone is driving that road right now. And somewhere in that 6-mile corridor, on the wide gravel shoulder where the road curves slightly east before straightening back north, a truck might be pulling over. Because the driver is tired. Because it's the responsible thing to do. Because 2 million miles of professional experience says that a 90-minute rest is the safe choice. I want you to think about what I've told you tonight. I want you to think about 14 incident reports over 16 years. About a highway patrol dashcam recording that is not available. About a wildlife biologist who can't sleep because of what the behavior implies. About Eddie Garza sitting in a dark cab for 4 hours and 11 minutes calculating whether the glass would hold. And I want you to think about what is in that forest on the east side of the road. What has been in that forest since long before the highway was built through it. What the highway cut through without asking permission. What has been watching the traffic move through its territory for as long as there has been traffic to watch. And what happens, occasionally, unpredictably, for reasons we will never fully understand, when someone stops. If you find yourself on US 51 North tonight, and your eyes are getting heavy, and there's a wide gravel shoulder coming up on the right, keep driving. Find a truck stop. Find a rest area. Find a town with lights and people and noise. But do not stop on that shoulder. Not at midnight. Not alone. Not there. Thumbs up if this story got into your chest, you know what to do. Bell subscribe, there are more highways. More corridors. More sections of American road with reputations that never make it into any official record. I'm finding them. Speech balloon long-haul drivers, drop your experiences below. I know you've heard things on those overnight runs that you've never told anyone. This is the place.